Oh man, am I ever excited to be restoring my Revox A77. As you can see, I finally pulled the trigger on this project. A project that's been on my dream board for like way over a decade, so you can imagine how excited I am. You know, a couple of days ago, when I got started on this project, I had this complete agenda, a total schedule of exactly when I was going to complete each task and move on to the next. Yeah, it took about 10 minutes to blow that plan right out of the water and make me realize very quickly that restoring an old classic tape machine like this is very similar to restoring an old classic Chevy. You know, you can have an agenda and you can have a plan of action, but once you get started, that plan usually gets tossed right out the window and you have to get very creative. Yeah, so far, every single task I've undertaken on this restoration project has been way more involved than it necessarily should have been. And this is just the reality of when you're rebuilding an old classic machine. It's the same exact thing with an old Chevy. You know, you open up the manual and you're looking at all this stuff and you're like, this makes total sense, no problem. You look into the vehicle itself and you open it up and you're like, wait, that doesn't look anything like the book. This stuff happens all the time, and it's exactly what's going on with this classic tape machine. You know, these reel motors are a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It shouldn't really take me more than about 30 minutes to take this reel motor out and dismantle it, fit new bearings, and put it back together. Well, I pull my reel motors out, and what do I find? I find the original bearing is seized inside the motor on both sides, both motors, and they're not moving. Those things, it's like they were welded in there. So I had no choice but to put some release agent into those bearings and let them sit overnight. And I just kept flipping them and adding more agent. And then finally I was able to put it on my bench vise and just tap those bearings out. Yeah, it's nice to have a set schedule when you're working on a restoration like this, but in reality, I think it's more like I have to learn how to roll with the punches. Just like that old Chevy, everything you open up is a potential can of worms, and you got to come up with a solution for it. You know, and this happens in almost every single task that you come across, like replacing the motor capacitors, these 3 big can capacitors. Well, I think there's 8 wires that connect back to those. Well, the original motor capacitors were wired with connectors like these. The replacement capacitors that I was putting in had a much wider terminal, right? So the connectors were no longer going to slide onto the terminal. So you see where I'm going with this. Instead of just simply being able to connect those new capacitors, I had to cut all the connections off, extend each one of those wires, and solder them to the new capacitors. Yeah, I love geeking out on electronics and finding solutions for stuff, but it takes time, right? Restoring a Revox is likely something that's not going to fall into a schedule. And so for today's session, let's just let the camera roll while I rebuild a couple of reel motors. One excellent bit of advice that I've heard from more than one professional that does this regularly is that when you're using contact cleaners like I am today, whether it's a contact cleaner with lubricant or without, either way, don't be applying those products directly onto electronics. Always take a Q-tip and apply the contact cleaner with lubricant in this case right onto my Q-tip, and then apply the lubricant to the part with the Q-tip. This is like a really fairly obvious piece of advice. If you've ever used one of these cans, you know that they can make a real mess really fast. It only takes a couple of seconds releasing a product like this before it just gets everywhere. So boom, it's taken a couple of days, but I just went from 2 completely seized reel motors to this. Oh man, that feels nice. Those new bearings, I can't even feel them. Totally silent. Yeah, the reel motors haven't spun like that in a long, long time. So that wasn't that hard, right? We just overhauled a couple of Revox A77 reel motors. Awesome. Now I only have about 999 other tasks to complete this overhaul. I better get busy. Thank you so much for sitting in on today's session, and please stay tuned as we breathe some life back into the Revox.